So this is the famous palace?
This is it, David's palace.
Here's the big question. Is the time of David historical or mythological?
He unites all the 12 tribes, builds the foundation of the house of God, what will be the temple.
For much of the last century, King David occupied an uneasy position in archaeology. He was central to ancient texts, foundational to Jewish and Christian tradition, and yet stubbornly elusive in the ground. Historians could read about him with confidence. Archaeologists, however, struggled to point to anything tangible that proved he ruled as more than a local chieftain. That gap slowly hardened into a consensus. By the late 20th century, many scholars argued that David was either a minor tribal leader or a largely mythologized figure whose importance had been exaggerated by later writers. The problem was not hostility toward ancient texts, it was evidence. Archaeology depends on stone, layout, scale, and material remains. And for decades, Jerusalem itself refused to cooperate. Excavations produced modest structures, fragmentary walls, and domestic buildings, nothing that resembled the seat of a powerful, centralized kingdom. A ruler described as uniting tribes, commanding armies, collecting tribute, and founding a dynastic capital should have left behind a palace. Not a symbolic residence, but a functional center of administration and authority. That palace did not appear. Over time, its absence became an argument in itself. What followed was not a single discovery, but a quiet shift in how a small group of archaeologists framed the problem. Instead of asking why David's palace could not be found in Jerusalem, they began asking whether Jerusalem was the wrong place to look. Jerusalem has been continuously inhabited for millennia. Layers overlap. Stones are reused. Later construction destroys earlier evidence. If a young kingdom had left fragile traces there, those traces may simply no longer exist. That possibility led researchers away from the capital and toward the edges of early Judah, places where authority would have needed to assert itself clearly and defensively. One site in particular refused to be ignored. Khirbet Qeiyafa sits on a rocky hill overlooking the Elah Valley, a strategic corridor connecting the coastal plains to the Judean highlands. For decades, it attracted little attention. It was remote, difficult to access, and appeared at first glance to be just another ruined hilltop. But when archaeologists began examining it more closely, the scale and organization of the remains did not fit the prevailing narrative of a weak, loosely organized society in the 10th century BCE. Full excavation changed everything. The first structures uncovered were massive fortification walls, far thicker and more carefully built than expected. This was not a casual enclosure. It was a planned defensive system. As digging expanded, the layout of the settlement became impossible to dismiss. Streets followed deliberate lines, buildings aligned with intention. The city had not grown organically over generations. It appeared to have been built rapidly, according to a single plan. Then came the gates. Not one, but two monumental gates were discovered, integrated into the fortifications. This detail immediately raised eyebrows. Most fortified sites from this period had a single gate, tightly controlled. Two gates required more labor, more oversight, and more resources. They suggested confidence, not improvisation. The location made the implication sharper. From Khirbet Qeiyafa, movement through the Elah Valley could be observed and controlled. Whoever built the city wanted visibility and command over traffic, trade, and military movement. This was not isolation. It was strategy. Scientific dating locked the site into a critical window. Carbon dating of olive pits and other organic materials sealed beneath the walls placed construction firmly in the 10th century BCE. The margin of error was narrow. The site could not easily be pushed earlier or later without distorting the data. Chronologically, it sat exactly where the biblical timeline places David. Even so, walls and gates alone were not enough to end the debate. Critics argued the site could be a military outpost, a frontier response to conflict, or even the work of a rival group. The real pressure came from what was found inside the city. Near the summit of the settlement, archaeologists uncovered large, centrally placed buildings unlike ordinary domestic structures. Their position was commanding, visible from much of the city below. In ancient settlements, the most important buildings were placed at the highest points. That pattern held here. Nearby, excavators found extensive storage areas, hundreds of large jars, remarkably uniform in size and shape. This was not household storage. It was institutional. Many of the jars bore seal impressions, marks used to indicate official control over goods. Such systems appear only where resources are collected, recorded, and redistributed under authority. In other words, taxation. This level of organization requires centralized power. Someone had the authority to demand goods, store them, and manage their distribution. That authority was not local or temporary. It was sustained. Resistance within the academic community intensified. Some argued the site was too far from Jerusalem to be connected to David. Others suggested it belonged to a different ethnic group altogether. Pottery styles, dietary remains, and construction methods became battlegrounds in a debate that was no longer about whether the site was impressive, but about what its implications meant. The word palace itself became controversial. Critics preferred neutral language, large building, administrative structure, anything that avoided naming authority directly. The debate held until archaeologists finished excavating the largest structure at the site. That building ended the argument. It stood at the highest point of Khirbet Qeiyafa, larger than any other known Judahite structure from the 10th century BCE. Its scale exceeded expectations entirely. The layout was deliberate, coherent, and elite in character. It was not a workshop, not a barracks, not a storage shed. It was a place designed for control and decision-making. Its vantage point allowed oversight of the city and the valley beyond. Roads, approaches, and movement could be monitored from above. Construction at this scale required organized labor, long-term planning, and reliable resources. This was not something a small tribal leader could assemble on impulse. Carbon dating confirmed the timing again. The structure belonged to the 10th century BCE. Attempts to stretch the margins failed to move it out of David's historical window. At the same time, similar signals began to appear at other early Judahite sites. Not identical buildings, but comparable signs of planning, administration, and centralized authority. A pattern emerged, and once a pattern appears, coincidence becomes a weaker explanation. None of this proves that a sign reading "Palace of King David" once stood over the doorway. Archaeology does not work that way. What it does provide is context, scale, and probability. A fortified city built rapidly according to a single plan. Monumental gates, centralized storage and seals, elite buildings at commanding positions, strategic control of a major valley. Precise dating to the period traditionally associated with David. When these elements are taken together, the list of plausible rulers becomes very short. The debate has not ended, and it likely never will. Archaeology rarely delivers absolute certainty, especially when dealing with figures known primarily through ancient texts. But what has changed is the burden of explanation. For decades, scholars argued that the absence of a palace proved David's kingdom was small or mythical. Khirbet Qeiyafa has reversed that logic. Now those who deny the existence of centralized authority in early Judah must explain how a site like this could exist at all. In that sense, the question is no longer whether archaeology can support the idea of a Davidic kingdom. It is whether the old dismissal can still be defended. The stones of Khirbet Qeiyafa do not tell stories. They do something more difficult. They narrow the range of possibilities, and in doing so, they bring the figure of King David out of abstraction and back into history, not as legend alone, but as a ruler whose world left marks in stone that are only now coming fully into view.